The night was colder than usual for mid-October, and the dense forest surrounding the isolated cabin was eerily silent. No wind rustled through the trees, no nocturnal animals stirred in the underbrush. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, like the world itself was holding its breath. The cabin had been abandoned for decades, but for Jacob and his three friends, Mark, Lisa, and Daniel, it was the perfect place to spend the weekend. A rustic getaway, far from the distractions of modern life. Jacob had inherited the cabin from his late uncle, an eccentric man who had lived his last years as a recluse. It had been left untouched since his passing, and Jacob figured it was time to reclaim it. It was supposed to be a fun trip, drinking, storytelling, and a little ghost hunting for laughs. But from the moment they arrived, something felt off. The cabin itself was unsettling. The wooden exterior was warped and rotting, the windows streaked with grime. A thick layer of dust coated everything inside, as if time had forgotten this place. The air smelled musty, tinged with something faintly metallic. And then there were the markings. Strange symbols were carved into the doorframe, the floorboards, and even the furniture. Deep, jagged etchings that looked almost frantic. Some of them resembled eyes, others twisted faces contorted in silent screams. "Your uncle was into some weird shit, man," Mark muttered, running a hand over the carvings. Jacob frowned. He was always paranoid. Maybe it was just his way of keeping people out. Lisa shivered. "Well, it's working. This place gives me the creeps," Daniel chuckled. "What, afraid of a little dust? It's just an old cabin." They should have left right then and there. That first night, they lit a fire in the stone fireplace and passed around a bottle of whiskey. The flickering flames cast long, shifting shadows across the walls. Jacob told stories about his uncle, how he'd claimed the land was cursed, that something lived in the woods. "Total lunatic," Jacob scoffed. He used to say the trees whispered at night, that you could hear them calling your name. Lisa shifted uncomfortably. "That's not funny." "I'm not trying to be funny," Jacob said. He really believed it. Mark rolled his eyes. "Well, your uncle obviously spent too much time alone out here." But Lisa wasn't laughing. She kept glancing at the window. "I swear I saw something moving out there." Daniel leaned forward. "You're just letting the stories get to you." Lisa shook her head. "No, I swear I saw a face." The others brushed it off, but that night, as they slept, the real horror began. Jacob woke first. At first, he wasn't sure what had roused him. Then he heard it, a slow, deliberate creaking like footsteps on old wood. He turned his head toward the window, and his breath caught in his throat. Someone, or something, was staring in at him. The figure was barely visible in the darkness, but its eyes, they gleamed unnaturally, reflecting the dim glow of the dying fire. And its face, stretched too long, too thin, like something that had once been human, but no longer was. Jacob blinked, and it was gone. He sat up, heart hammering. He glanced around the room. The others were still asleep, their slow breathing filling the silence. Maybe he had imagined it, but then the whispering began. At first it was faint, like wind rustling through leaves. Then it grew louder, words forming, voices overlapping. "Come outside." Jacob froze. "Come into the trees." A chill crawled up his spine. He covered his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. Then the whispering stopped. The next morning he told the others what he had seen. Lisa paled. "I told you I saw something." Mark and Daniel were skeptical. "It was probably an animal," like Daniel reasoned. Lisa shook her head. "No animal looks like that." They decided to explore the area, hoping to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, they found something that made their blood run cold. Buried beneath the dead leaves were more symbols, carved into the trees, just like the ones in the cabin. And then they found the clearing. At its center stood an old wooden effigy, humanoid with elongated limbs, its head twisted unnaturally to one side. It was covered in decayed cloth, and the symbols were carved all over it. Lisa covered her mouth. "What the hell is this?" Jacob swallowed hard. "I don't know." A low groan echoed through the trees. The wind picked up, whispering through the branches. Lisa turned sharply. "We need to leave." They hurried back to the cabin, locking the doors, barring the windows. They didn't talk about what they had seen. That night, the real nightmare began. The whispering returned, but this time it was inside the cabin. It started as a soft murmur, then grew louder, more insistent. The firelight flickered, casting shifting shadows across the walls. Then came the knocking. It started slow, 3 deliberate knocks on the front door, then the side window, then the back door. Lisa whimpered. "Oh my God!" Mark grabbed a knife from the table. "It's someone screwing with us." Jacob knew better. The knocking continued, rhythmic and unrelenting, and then the door creaked open on its own. Beyond it stood darkness, a yawning void, and from that void something stepped inside. It was tall, too tall. Its arms hung at unnatural angles, its fingers too long. Its face was a mask of stretched, withered skin, its eyes sunken and black. The whispering grew deafening. "You should not be here." Jacob couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing stepped closer. Daniel screamed, bolting for the back door. The moment he touched the handle, the lights flickered violently, and the entire cabin shuddered. Lisa shrieked as unseen hands grabbed her, yanking her backward. Mark lunged for her, but she was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Jacob stumbled toward the door, but the thing blocked his path. It loomed over him, its hollow gaze locking onto his. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The whispering stopped. Lisa was nowhere to be found. The police arrived the next day after Jacob and the others fled the cabin, frantic and incoherent. They searched for Lisa, but found no trace of her. Only the effigy in the woods remained. But it was different now. Lisa's clothes were draped over it, and beneath them, newly carved into the wood, was her name. Jacob never returned to the cabin. He never spoke about what had happened. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the trees, he swore he could still hear the whispering, calling his name.
Story number 2.
The road to the cabin was barely a road at all, just a winding dirt path cutting through the dense forest, swallowed by shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. Sam gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white as his girlfriend, Rachel, stared out the window, her breath fogging up the glass. "This place is seriously in the middle of nowhere," she murmured. "That's the point," Sam said with a grin. "No cell service, no traffic, no distractions. Just us and nature." Rachel sighed. "I don't like how quiet it is." From the back seat, their friends Eric and Megan chuckled. "Come on, Rach," Eric teased. "You afraid Bigfoot's gonna get you?" Megan elbowed him. "More like axe murderers. Isn't this exactly how horror movies start?" Sam rolled his eyes. "It's just a cabin. My uncle owned it for years, used to come up here all the time. No murders, no ghosts, just peace and quiet." They pulled up to the cabin, an old wooden structure nestled between towering trees. It looked abandoned, weathered, worn, as if the forest had been slowly reclaiming it. The windows were coated in grime, and the porch sagged under their weight as they stepped onto it. "Creepy," Rachel muttered. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and the scent of aged wood. Animal skulls hung from the walls. A strange decoration choice, but Sam's uncle had been a hunter. "I hate this," Rachel said, hugging herself. Megan smirked. "You're just spooked." But Rachel wasn't just spooked, she felt watched. That night, as they sat around the fireplace, sipping whiskey and telling stories, the air in the room grew heavy. The fire crackled, but the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed darker, deeper. Then came the tapping. At first it was soft, almost rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. They froze, glancing toward the window. "Probably a branch," Sam said, forcing a laugh. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Closer. Rachel's stomach twisted. She stood up, crossing the room to peek outside. The darkness beyond the window was thick, impenetrable. Then something moved. Just for a second, a pale shape, barely visible, standing at the tree line. Rachel stumbled back. "There's someone out there," Eric groaned. "It's probably a deer or something." But Rachel knew what she saw. Something human. That night, she barely slept. The others drifted off easily, but Rachel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. Sometime after midnight, she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. But it wasn't at the window anymore. It was at the door. She sat up, heart hammering, straining to hear over the pounding in her ears. Then the doorknob turned, slowly, deliberately. Rachel clamped a hand over her mouth, holding in a scream. The door didn't open, but something was outside, listening, waiting. By morning, the footprints were there, deep impressions in the dirt just outside the cabin door. Bare footprints, too large to be human. Rachel wanted to leave, begged them to pack up and go, but Sam refused. "Come on. We drove all the way out here. There's nothing out there." Rachel wasn't convinced. Neither was Megan. That night, Megan whispered, "I think Rachel's right. Something feels wrong." Rachel nodded. "I saw it, I swear." Then the smell hit them, rotten, sour, like something had died just outside the cabin. Eric gagged. "Jesus, what is that?" Then the tapping started again, only this time it was inside. They turned slowly toward the hallway. Something was standing there, tall, thin. Its face stretched too long, too pale. Its mouth hung open, but no sound came out. The tapping continued. Its fingers long, bony, drummed against the wall. Tap, tap, tap. Rachel screamed. Sam grabbed the nearest thing, a fire poker, and swung, but the thing was gone, vanished. The door slammed open as if by some invisible force, and the cold night air rushed in. They didn't stay to find out more. They ran. By the time they reached the car, the cabin looked different, darker, as if the woods had swallowed it whole. Sam started the engine, peeling down the dirt road. No one spoke. They didn't look back, but Rachel swore she could still hear it. Tap, tap, tap.
Story number 3.
The road to Black Hollow Cabin twisted through miles of dense forest, the towering pines pressing in from all sides. It had been abandoned for nearly 50 years, but for Michael and his sister Emily, it was a place full of childhood memories. Their grandfather had built it, and though he had died under mysterious circumstances, the cabin remained in the family. Now, after years of neglect, Michael had convinced Emily to join him for a weekend of fixing it up before deciding whether to sell it. "This place looks worse than I remember," Emily muttered as they pulled into the clearing. The cabin loomed before them, its wooden walls darkened with age, its windows reflecting nothing but the gray sky. Michael shut off the engine. It just needs a little work. As they stepped onto the porch, the wood groaned beneath their feet. The front door was already slightly ajar. Emily frowned. "Did you leave it open last time?" Michael hesitated. "I haven't been here in over 10 years. A cold breeze pushed past them, carrying with it the scent of damp wood and something else, something foul. Inside, the cabin was just as they remembered. A single-room layout with an old brick fireplace, a rickety dining table, and a pair of wooden chairs. Dust blanketed every surface, and the air was thick with silence. Emily shivered. "This place gives me the creeps." Michael forced a laugh. "Come on, it's just an old cabin." They spent the day cleaning, knocking down cobwebs, and fixing what they could. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Michael set up a small fire in the fireplace. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. That was when they heard it, a soft scratching, coming from the far corner of the room. Emily froze. "What was that?" Michael turned, his eyes narrowing. The noise was faint but unmistakable, like nails dragging against wood. He stepped closer. Probably a raccoon or something stuck in the walls. Then the whispering began. It was barely audible, just beneath the crackling of the fire, but it was there, low, breathy voices weaving in and out of the silence. Michael swallowed. "Do you hear that?" Emily nodded, her face pale. "Someone's whispering." The fire dimmed suddenly, as if something had sucked the warmth from the room. Then the knocking started, slow, rhythmic, from beneath the floor. Knock, knock, knock. Michael took a step back. "That's not an animal." The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until the entire floor seemed to shake beneath them. Then, without warning, the trapdoor in the corner burst open. Emily screamed. A gust of icy air rushed from the darkness below, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of rot. Michael grabbed a flashlight, shining it into the gaping hole. Something moved. A shape, thin, twisted, scuttled back into the shadows. Its limbs were too long, its fingers scraping against the dirt floor beneath the cabin. Emily grabbed Michael's arm. "We have to go. Now." As they turned toward the door, it slammed shut on its own. The whispering returned, louder this time, surrounding them, pressing against their ears. Michael grabbed a chair and threw it at the window. The glass shattered, and he pulled Emily through, ignoring the cuts on his arms as they scrambled to the car. The cabin shuddered violently, the door rattling as if something inside was desperate to escape. They didn't look back as they sped away, the forest swallowing the cabin once more. The next morning, Michael called a demolition crew. Black Hollow Cabin was torn down, reduced to nothing but rubble. But beneath the wreckage, buried in the dirt, they found something chilling. A trapdoor leading even deeper underground. And when they pried it open, they found a single wooden chair, facing the remains of an old rotting bed, as if someone had been sitting there, watching, waiting.
Story number 4.
The road to the cabin was narrow and winding, flanked by dense trees that seemed to close in as Eric drove deeper into the forest. The headlights barely cut through the thick fog rolling in, and for a moment he regretted agreeing to this trip. His girlfriend, Claire, sat beside him, scrolling through her phone, while their friends, Ben and Jessica, chatted in the back seat. "You sure this place is safe?" Jessica asked, peering out the window. "It feels forgotten," Ben scoffed. "That's what makes it cool. No distractions, no neighbors, just us and the wilderness." Eric nodded, though he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. His uncle had left him the cabin in his will, but the place had been abandoned for over 30 years. No one in the family ever talked about why. When they arrived, the cabin was barely visible through the mist. The wooden structure was intact but worn, the windows covered in dust. An old porch swing creaked in the wind, though there was no breeze. Claire shivered. "Let's just go inside." Eric pushed the door open, and a stale, musty smell greeted them. The interior was simple: wooden furniture, an old stone fireplace, a single hallway leading to the bedrooms. A layer of dust coated everything. "Feels like a time capsule," Ben muttered, running his fingers over a bookshelf filled with old yellowed novels. As they unpacked, Claire found a box on the kitchen counter, as if someone had left it there deliberately. Inside were faded Polaroids of the cabin's previous owners. Jessica flipped through them. Creepy. Look at their faces. No one is smiling. Eric frowned. The last photo in the stack was different. It showed a man standing in the cabin's doorway, his face obscured by shadow. Unlike the others, this one had a date scribbled on the back. October 13th, 1987. "That's today," Claire whispered. Ben forced a laugh. "It's a coincidence." But Eric wasn't convinced. That night, as they sat by the fireplace, the wind picked up outside, howling through the trees. The power had long since gone out, so they relied on candles and lanterns. Then the knocking started. It came from the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Jessica gasped. "Who the hell?" Eric grabbed a flashlight and moved cautiously to the door. He hesitated before pulling it open. Nothing. The forest stretched out in front of him, shrouded in darkness. The mist was thicker now, swirling unnaturally. He shut the door and turned back to the group. Probably just the wind. But then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. Louder this time. Claire clutched his arm. "That's not the wind." Ben snatched a fire poker from the hearth. "Screw this. Let's see who's messing with us." He flung the door open. The porch was empty, but something had changed. The Polaroids were now scattered across the floor, and in the middle of them was a new photo, one that hadn't been in the box before. It showed the four of them, sitting by the fireplace, just as they were now. Jessica's voice trembled. No, that's impossible." A cold breeze swept through the room, snuffing out the candles. Then the whispering started. Low, indistinct, coming from all around them. Eric grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the hallway. At the end of it, something stood in the doorway of the bedroom. A tall, shadowy figure, motionless, watching, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Eric couldn't breathe. Then, as the flashlight flickered, it stepped forward. Claire screamed. The fire exploded in the hearth, sending embers flying. The walls groaned, the air thick with the smell of smoke and decay. Eric grabbed Claire's hand. "We have to get out of here!" Ben and Jessica ran ahead, fumbling with the door. It wouldn't open. The whispers turned into a deafening roar. Then, all at once, silence. The door swung open. They bolted for the car, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. As Eric started the engine, he dared one last glance at the cabin. The figure stood on the porch now, closer, clearer. Its face was no longer in shadow. It was Eric's uncle, rotting, grinning, and holding a camera. The flash went off. Then everything went dark.
Story number 5.
The old cabin had been in Lauren's family for generations, but no one had set foot in it for nearly 30 years. It was a forgotten relic deep in the Appalachian woods, tucked away from civilization. Her grandfather had lived there until his sudden disappearance in 1993. No body was ever found. Just the cabin, empty and silent, as if he had simply walked into the forest and never returned. Now Lauren and her brother Jake had come to assess the place, to decide whether to sell it or tear it down. The drive up the narrow, overgrown road was rough, the forest pressing in from all sides. When they finally arrived, the cabin stood exactly as it had in the faded photographs their mother had kept. Weathered wood, broken shutters, a sagging porch. But something felt wrong. The front door was open. Lauren and Jake exchanged uneasy glances. "Did someone break in?" Jake muttered. Lauren hesitated before stepping inside. Dust coated everything, but there were no signs of animals or squatters. The air was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of something rotting. "Let's make this quick," Lauren said. They began clearing debris, tossing broken furniture outside. As Jake worked in the back bedroom, Lauren found herself drawn to the fireplace. Above it hung an old mirror, clouded with age, and in the reflection she saw movement. Her breath caught. A figure stood behind her. She spun around. Nothing, just the empty cabin. She swallowed hard and turned back to the mirror. This time, the reflection was different. The room behind her was no longer abandoned. It looked lived in. Fresh logs crackled in the fireplace, the furniture was intact, and a man sat in the old rocking chair. Lauren's heart pounded. It was her grandfather. He was staring at her through the mirror, his expression blank, his eyes hollow. Then his mouth moved. "Leave now." The whisper was barely audible, but it came from behind her, not from the mirror. Lauren whirled around. The room was exactly as it had been, dusty, broken, untouched for decades. "Jake," she called, her voice shaking. No response. She rushed toward the bedroom where he had been working, but as she stepped into the doorway, her stomach dropped. The room was empty. No furniture, no debris, no Jake. Just wooden walls covered in deep, jagged scratches, as if something had clawed at them for years. She backed away, her pulse hammering. "Jake!" A slow creaking sound echoed through the cabin. The rocking chair. It was moving. Lauren's breath hitched. The mirror still showed the impossible reflection of a warm, untouched cabin. And in the chair, her grandfather was no longer sitting. He was standing. Closer. His reflection stared at her, head tilting in that unnatural way that sent ice down her spine. Then his lips moved again. "He's already in the walls." A sharp, scraping noise filled the air. Wood splintering, something shifting behind the cabin walls. Something alive. Lauren turned and ran, sprinting out of the cabin and into the car. She fumbled with the keys, her shaking hands barely able to start the engine. And then, a whisper, right beside her ear. Too late. The last thing she saw before she sped away was the cabin door swinging shut on its own. And in the reflection of her rearview mirror, her grandfather standing on the porch, smiling.
Story number 6.
The cabin had been abandoned for nearly 70 years, left to rot deep in the Colorado wilderness. No one knew why the original owners had left so suddenly, or why they never returned. Some said it was the brutal winters. Others whispered of something worse. Ethan and his 3 friends, Mark, Lisa, and Hannah, didn't care about the stories. They were here for an adventure. A weekend off the grid, no cell service, just the crackling of a fire and the stillness of nature. The drive-up had been rough, the trail barely navigable, but when they arrived, the cabin was still standing. Barely. The wooden structure was warped from time and weather, the windows clouded with dust. As they stepped inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of aged wood and something faintly metallic. Mark dropped his bag. "Cozy." Lisa wrinkled her nose. "It smells weird." Hannah shivered. "It's freezing in here." Ethan moved to the fireplace and found a pile of dry logs stacked neatly beside it. Strange. It looked as if someone had been here recently. By nightfall, the fire was roaring, casting flickering shadows against the walls. The 4 of them sat around it, drinking, laughing, until Lisa suddenly went quiet. She was staring at the far wall, her face pale. "There's something carved into the wood," she whispered. They all turned. The firelight illuminated a series of deep scratches in the wall, uneven, jagged. Words. "Do not open the door after midnight." Mark scoffed. "Yeah, okay. Real original." But Hannah hugged herself, glancing at the front door. Who wrote it? Ethan tried to laugh it off, but something about it unsettled him. That night, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the cabin. The fire had died down, leaving them in near darkness. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then, just past midnight, 3 knocks. Soft, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Ethan held his breath. Then the doorknob turned, slowly, a clicking sound like someone testing the lock. He sat up, his pulse hammering. Across the room, Hannah did the same. "You hear that?" she mouthed. He nodded. Knock, knock, knock. Lisa whimpered in her sleep, turning over. Mark didn't stir. Ethan stood carefully, creeping toward the door. His body was screaming at him to stop, to stay away. Then, a whisper. Right outside the door, not words, just a sound, a breath. His hand hovered over the lock. A sudden chill flooded through him, stopping him cold. The warning on the wall burned in his mind. "Do not open the door after midnight." He stumbled back just as Lisa shot up, gasping. "There's someone in here," she choked out. Hannah grabbed the flashlight and swept it across the cabin. Nothing, just the 4 of them. Then Lisa pointed, trembling. The mirror above the fireplace. The reflection wasn't right. They saw themselves, Ethan, Lisa, Hannah, and Mark. But there was a 5th figure standing behind them. Tall, shadowed, grinning. Lisa screamed. The fire flared suddenly, casting the room in blinding light. The wind roared, the cabin walls shaking. Then, silence. When the fire dimmed, the mirror was cracked, and the door was wide open. The forest outside was still, impossibly dark, but something was missing. Mark, he was gone. His sleeping bag lay empty, his boots still by the door. No footprints, no sound, just gone. Ethan ran outside, calling his name, but the night swallowed his voice. No one ever saw Mark again. They left at dawn, never speaking of what happened. But weeks later, Ethan checked his phone, scrolling through the photos they had taken before that night. In every single one in the background, just barely visible in the cabin's window, a tall, shadowed figure, watching, waiting.
Story number 7.
The old cabin had stood deep in the Tennessee woods for as long as anyone could remember. It had no history, no records, just rumors. Stories of people who entered but never left. Some said it was cursed, others swore it was haunted. None of that mattered to Daniel. To him, it was just an abandoned structure, a perfect spot for his photography project. He had a thing for forgotten places, and this one was truly in the middle of nowhere. His girlfriend, Alyssa, wasn't thrilled about it, but she had agreed to come along. They hiked for nearly 2 hours before they found it. The cabin was in worse shape than Daniel expected. Half sunken into the earth, its roof sagging, vines choking its frame. The front door was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Alyssa hesitated. This place feels wrong. Daniel raised his camera, snapping a few shots. That's what makes it cool. She sighed, but followed him inside. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay. Dust particles floated in the weak sunlight, filtering through the broken windows. Then Daniel noticed something odd. The furniture, though covered in dust, was arranged perfectly. The wooden chairs faced the cold fireplace, and a single plate sat on the old dining table as if someone had been about to eat. Alyssa hugged herself. It's like someone just left. Daniel took another picture. That's when he saw it. The mirror above the fireplace. His reflection was there, his camera raised, Alyssa standing beside him. But there was someone else in the reflection. A man. Sitting in the chair closest to the fire, his back to them. Daniel spun around, his breath catching. Nothing. The chair was empty. His hands trembled as he checked his camera. The photo showed the same thing. An old man sitting there, completely still. Alyssa grabbed his arm. Daniel, we need to leave. Then the air shifted. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the shadows darker. The air, once stale, was now thick with the overwhelming scent of rotting meat. Then a creak from behind them. Slow, deliberate. They turned toward the hallway leading to the back of the cabin. The door at the end was cracked open, just an inch. Alyssa's voice was barely a whisper. Was that open before? Daniel shook his head. Then something moved behind it, a shape. Tall, motionless, watching. A guttural whisper filled the room, dry and rasping, as if unused for decades. You shouldn't be here. Daniel's camera flashed as it snapped a photo on its own. Then the door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire cabin. Alyssa screamed. Daniel grabbed her hand and bolted for the front door, nearly tripping over the threshold. As soon as they stepped outside, the air felt lighter, the tension lifting. They ran without stopping, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the dense woods. It wasn't until they reached the car that Daniel dared to look at his camera. The last photo it had taken, the old man was no longer sitting. He was standing and grinning.
Story number 8.
The cabin had been cheap, too cheap. Logan should have questioned why a fully furnished place deep in the Montana woods was available for almost nothing. But he and his wife, Rachel, had been desperate for a getaway, and a weekend off-grid sounded perfect. The drive was long, the dirt road barely wide enough for their SUV. The trees loomed over them, dense and silent, as if they were driving into another world. When they arrived, the cabin was exactly as it had been in the listing. A small, rustic structure with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney. The previous owners had left it fully stocked, pots, dishes, even blankets folded neatly on the couch. Rachel hesitated before stepping inside. It's like they left in a hurry. Logan kissed her temple. That just means less work for us. They spent the day exploring the surroundings, enjoying the crisp autumn air. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Logan started a fire while Rachel prepared dinner. That was when they heard it. A soft knock at the door. Logan frowned. Who the hell would be out here? Rachel peeked through the window. The porch was empty. The woods beyond were still. Another knock. Slow, measured. Logan hesitated before opening the door. The air outside was deathly cold, the scent of pine heavy in the air. But no one was there, just footprints. Bare, human footprints leading up to the porch. Then stopping. Rachel grabbed his arm. Let's go inside. Logan shut the door and locked it, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. That night, as they lay in bed, Rachel whispered, "Do you hear that?" Logan listened. Soft creaking, like footsteps. From the attic. His stomach tightened. There's no attic. Rachel sat up. Then what the hell is that? The footsteps moved slowly across the ceiling, deliberate and heavy, as if something or someone was pacing. Then, a faint scratching at the bedroom door. Logan shot up, heart pounding. The knob twisted slightly as if being tested. He reached for the bedside lamp, but before he could turn it on, Rachel let out a strangled gasp. She was staring at the mirror across the room. Logan followed her gaze. Their reflection was there, both of them sitting up in bed, frozen in terror. But the door behind them in the mirror was open, and someone was standing in the doorway. A tall, emaciated figure, its face a blur of shadows, its mouth stretched too wide in an unnatural grin. The scratching at the real door stopped. A moment of silence. Then a slow, deliberate whisper. "Let me in." Rachel grabbed Logan's hand, her nails digging into his skin. "We have to leave. Now." They bolted from the cabin, not bothering to grab their bags. Logan started the car with shaking hands, his foot slamming on the gas. As they sped away, Rachel turned back one last time. The cabin stood dark and silent, but on the porch, watching them go, a tall, grinning figure, bare feet in the dirt, waiting.